Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is the Australian Bunyip. So before I get into the episode, there's just a couple things that I want to talk about. Number one, as we all know, right now the world is kind of burning. Everything's crumbling to the ground. Shit has kind of hit the fan. It's really rough out there. And so I really hope that I'm going to continue to put out the 2 episodes a week. I'm hoping that this content gives at least somebody out there a little bit of a relief. Part of the reason why I like performing and entertaining and creating content is to give people a way to kind of like escape reality. So please let me know if that's something that I do for you, because that would be lovely just to know, because I know I would like an escape from reality right now. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that for like weeks now, I think, like episodes upon episodes upon episodes, I've talked about the fact that I have merch and how I'm going to start posting pictures of it and I'm going to do a little photo shoot and whatever. I have been putting this off for a very specific reason, and that is for the fact that my hair has not been touched by a professional hair specialist since January. So in a couple days, I'm getting my hair cut and colored. It's going to be super dope. It's going to be super fun. So I figured once I get everything like looking normal again, then, I'll be able to take pictures. The swelling in my nose has gone down, so I can take pictures again and not feel like Mr. Potato Head in a sweater. So there will be pictures posted very soon of all of that. So please keep your eye out on our social media. I know I plug it at the end, but I'm going to plug it here because I'm talking about it. Our Instagram is at Whispers From Below. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. I don't know why I said we. It's just me doing it. But just keep your eye out for stuff like that. That content is going to be coming out soon. I haven't been posting as much recently. I've had some stuff going on in my personal life, but I'm going to get back to posting regularly on that account. So please, please, please share it with your friends. Keep an eye out. Make sure you sort of, know what's going on. And last but not least, as far as guidelines for this episode goes, it's a pretty chill one. It's not a terribly aggressive one. It's not that dark and twisted. And I know sometimes I say that and then I talk about like someone getting like hung. Well, it's hanged. It's the proper term. But I really truly think that this one's going to be acceptable. Like cryptids, mythological creatures, stuff like that. That's stuff that you research when you're very, very young. You learn about it in school and things like that. But the last one I did like this was mermaids. The difference is that mermaids are very like sexualized. These are not. This is not a sexualized creature in the slightest. So there should be nothing in here that's like too terrible for younger listeners. So you're good to go. You don't need to come back next week. But, let's get into it. It's a pretty cool one, I think. So for starters, the Bunyip, for those of you that don't know, it's an Australian Aboriginal mythological creature. It's basically like a cryptid now. People think that they still exist and that they're definitely a thing, but no one's ever really seen one. And what's really interesting is like if you look up pictures, and I'm going to talk about this a little later in the episode, but just as a little side note, if you like Google Bunyip, the Google image pool, normally if you Google like Bigfoot, you know that you're going to get a bunch of this, a bunch of pictures. Loch Ness Monster, you're going to get pictures in that one where its head is poking out of the water, stuff like that. With the Bunyip, when you Google it, there's like 80 different pictures and they all look completely different. Like nobody can really nail down what it looks like. So there's all these different accounts of people supposedly seeing this animal, but they're all completely different. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but just a fun note, because I know a lot of people, when they listen to the podcast, they'll go and they'll be like, oh, I don't know what he's talking about. Let me look it up real quick while I'm listening so that I have an idea. But that won't help you this time. That that won't help you like in the slightest. So again, like accounts really vary of what this creature looks like. There's at least 9 different accounts of different bunyips, like in the same area. But all of them have the same sort of idea besides what they look like, if that makes sense. They're all said to lurk in swamps, rivers, creeks, water holes, and billabongs, which, oh my god, that is such an Aussie term. I have a couple Australian friends, and billabong is just like that is so Aussie. Anyway, it's basically like, for those of you that don't know, a billabong is like when a river kind of changes its course, and then there's just a huge, like, pool of water that's kinda, like, dead, like, nothing really lives in there. It's called a billabong. So it's like a pond that doesn't have a lot of life in it because no river is, like, directly running into it, if that makes sense. The word bunyip is translated from the Wemba Wemba, or the I'm so sorry if I butcher any of this, the Wurgaya language of the Aboriginals. This word means devil or evil spirit. So already we're getting off to a sort of a rough foot with this poor creature who is being dragged as this terrible, awful, evil monster. And we don't even know about them yet. So that says a lot. Um, it's become such a big thing in Australia. It's still big, I would say, outside of Australia, but like you hear about it more in pop culture today and things like that from media that comes from Australia, like Australian media, if that makes sense. But there's even a river named after it, and there's a town. So there's the Bunyip River, and there's a town called Bunyip, Victoria. A lot of the legends and the myths come from Victoria, that region. So that's why they have a town named Bunyip. There are a couple of suggestions about why these Bunyip legends started, and like how they kind of got to that point, and that's mostly what lore about the Bunyip is. Because basically, like, it's a creature that's hostile. Like, it's a really basic concept. What's not basic is the fact that the Aboriginals created this creature, and also, like, the way that they sort of concocted this creature. There are a couple different theories about how and why they made him. One of them that seems very, like, on par, like, makes sense. Um, because one of the descriptions talks about a creature that has like smooth black fur, prominent, prominent like yellow apricot sort of colored eyes, and a terrifying bellow, like a really loud roar. So one explanation, for both the description and the legend involves accounts of the fact that seals would swim up the rivers, like the Murray and the Darling rivers, which are two rivers where people had a lot of sightings of bunyips. So part of the reason that they could think they didn't know what the creature was and it was very scary, they see a seal swimming up the river. There are accounts of like seal bones and stuff being up there. They definitely had swam up there, so it's very possible that they saw this seal, didn't know what it was, claimed that it was a bunyip, move on. Sort of like a legend in their culture, because it's not a common thing. Like they wouldn't swim up there all the time. But when they did, I'm sure it was very scary to see a creature that you didn't know. Um, they, a lot of pictures that you'll see, there's one really, really common picture with like, also they're all drawn, which is also really interesting. There's no like, how there's always like a photo of Bigfoot or like a photo of a unicorn. Like that's not really in existence because the accounts are so varied. Like nobody has like a quote unquote picture of a bunyip, like that's not really a thing. But when you look it up, there's this one drawing that comes up really frequently, of this like giant, it almost looks like a puma in the water, but like huge, and it's like eating this person. Like it's got the person in its mouth, and it's like it looks like it just like crashed out of the water. um so a lot of times they resembled like big dogs with like fins that were in the water, much like a seal. There's another account that describes the bunyip as looking like just an enormous starfish. So if that gives you any idea of the variation of what it can be, uh some people think it looks like a starfish, just like a really big, like a starfish that kind of like, there's a picture of it, it's really bizarre. but it kind of like walks like a dog, like on four of its legs, but it's like a starfish, if that makes sense. Um, and like everything that they all agree on is that this animal is dangerous. Like whether or not it's trying to be or it's provoked or whatever, that's not really important to them. What's important is that this animal is dangerous and they have to be careful. This is an extremely dreaded creature in their culture. It supposedly has killed many, many Aboriginal people. It probably didn't. I don't mean to like stamp on a myth or like ruin, an important part of somebody's culture. Like that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to say is that there are so many varied accounts of what this creature looks like, and Australia has so many like strange animals that I'm sure like way, way, way back when in like the 1800s when this stuff sort of started, maybe they just like saw like an animal that they didn't really know what it was yet. And so they just called it something else. I mean, that's a really common thing. Like that's why, a lot of mermaid myths started was because of manatees and, things like that. Like there's always something. Rhinos was a really big reason that unicorn myths got started. People believe that the rhinoceros was a unicorn, which obviously we know it kind of is, right? It's kind of a unicorn. Anyway, it's like a big, like, chunky unicorn. I think they're cool. I like rhinos. Anyway, but it's just interesting to note that, like, they just kind of didn't know what a creature was, so they named it something else. Is sort of the gist, the vibe, 60% of the descriptions match the idea that it's a seal, sort of like a seal-like creature. Maybe it's a little bigger, maybe it's a little smaller, maybe the fur is a different color, but for the most part, like 60% of the descriptions that you'll find describe it as being like a seal. 20% of the descriptions are describing it as having an extremely long neck with a really small head and like feathers and stuff, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the rest of them are way too randomized, way too ridiculous, way too out of the box for them to be sort of put in any categories, like the starfish. Um, they almost always have really black or dark brown fur or feathers. Sharp fangs. They're always nocturnal, and they always inhabit a swamp, a river, a billabong, something like that, like water. They're always like an amphibious creature. Um, the nocturnal part is really interesting to note because that sort of adds mystery to a creature. A lot of times you'll see that, like, with myths and legends about cryptids, they're like, they only come out at night. And it's like, of course they only come out at night, because if they came out during the day, then we'd probably have photographs of it. But because it only comes out at night when it's really hard to see, you can always imagine that you've seen it, even though like it could be a tree. You know what I mean? Like that's where I'm like, oh, of course it's nocturnal. That way nobody knows it exists. It's just lame. Uh, anyway, um, supposedly they are a marsupial. Um, I think marsupial is the right word, right? No, 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 no. It doesn't have a pouch. It's oh my god, I'm blanking on the word. It's like an echidna or a platypus. Like it lays eggs. It's one of those. It's one of the it's a mammal that lays eggs. Does that I forget the name for that. It's a mammal that lays eggs. The bottom line, I'm not a scientist. Sorry, everybody. Supposedly they lay their eggs in platypus nests, and the eggs look similar enough that you wouldn't like see a difference, and that's how they sort of get their eggs to hatch. Um, they are sometimes described as like these bloodthirsty human killers that are like always out to kill the aboriginals and things like that. And then other times they're described like kind of like a bear. Like if you come near it and you piss it off, like it's going to kill you. But if you stay away from it and you leave it alone, it's not going to hurt you. So it kind of depends on which versions of the stories you're reading. With most, mythological stories, it kind of depends on the region that sort of says, it's going to kill you, or like don't go near it, whatever. There are a ton of accounts of people supposedly finding bones of a bunyip. Now, this is really easily explained, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the reason that this was really big was because this was around the time that European settlers had just started to come to Australia, and the Aboriginals were coming up to them and telling them, like, hey, if there's one thing you need to know about Australia, which, besides just telling them that, like, everything in Australia is going to kill you, Like, Australia is home to, like, so many poisonous creatures and things like that. Like, even just being like, "Hey, 90% of the creatures here are gonna kill you. Okay, have fun, bye." They decided to tell them about the bunyip. So, because I mean, you have to come from the perspective of the people entering this new strange land. And Australia is home to, as we know, really bizarre looking things like kangaroos and koalas and like all these things that nobody had ever seen before. So when they showed up and these aboriginals were like, "Hey, like kangaroos exist, koalas exist, so does the bunyip." They were just like, "Yeah, okay." Like, they just believed it. They were like, "This is a thing that lives in swamps, and we're gonna stay away from it." Like, I would do the same thing, you know? It makes sense. Um, Australia, eh, the Australian, like, Aboriginal people were very cautious about, number one, the settlers, obviously, as most, like, sort of Native American-based tribes were when white people showed up. The Aboriginals were sort of a similar way. Um, but also they were very cautious about like warning people. Like they were still very kind and they would like be very cautious and say like you need to be careful when you go here or here or here. There are things that can kill you. So they spread the word of the bunyip very, very fast. Now, as we know, people started finding fossils and bones around this period of time, and they weren't really sure what they were yet. You know, we didn't really understand evolution, we didn't understand anything like that. So when they would find a bone, they'd be like, "Oh my god, it's a creature that exists today." Which, you know, as we know now is not completely true. So a lot of the bones ended up getting like placed in museums as being a bunyip bone, and it was a big attraction and all this stuff because nobody had really seen one or taken a picture. But a lot of these bones were actually of an extinct species of marsupial that was called a diprotodon. And the diprotodon was a prehistoric marsupial that was like a it was like really big. It was kind of like the size of maybe like a probably like the size of like I already mentioned a rhino, but like a rhino. But it looked like a wombat, if that makes sense. Like the closest ancestors to this creature are like a koala and a wombat. And a lot of times they're just called giant wombats. Um, that's like its colloquial term. So when people were finding these giant bones that were like looked like they could have been from like a mammal and whatever, they were like, it's definitely a bunyip. Even though it was just, you know, some little marsupial. Well, little is a strong word. Some big ass marsupial that roamed, you know, Australia before people even started roaming it. Although they are land animals, both the Diprotodon and the Bunyip, a lot of their bones were found in bodies of water or around bodies of water. And that has a really easy explanation of the fact that, like, sometimes bodies of water change, especially in an area like Australia that can tend, I mean, it can be really, really dry. It can be a really, really dry place. So a lot of times the rivers and stuff will move and shift over time based on the rainfall and erosion and things like that. There's all sorts of scientific words that I could throw in here to make me sound smart, but I truly like this isn't something that I know a lot about. I do know that it happens though, and so that would explain why like suddenly there's a billabong with bones in it because the river sort of diverted and then covered the bones and now they're discovering them. You know, like there are some very easy explanations for that. It could also just be a simple fact of like, obviously creatures need water to live, so maybe they would just sit by the water and then they would also die by the water. And then over time, things move. Maybe the bones fell in the water. You know, like very simple stuff. More of these bones and fossils ended up being found in the Wellington Caves, and this was a really, really big deal because the Wellington Caves was home to like so many different like prehistoric fossils and things like that. Like it was a really important like scientific endeavor to find them, just you know, point blank period. But also it was important in the Bunyip myth because then these bones started to become like it started to make the bunyip real to the people that lived there because again this was found in a time when they didn't know that these could be fossils. They found it at a time when if you found a bone that was a creature that had died here like yesterday, you know. These bones were said to be quote quadruple much larger than the ox or buffalo unquote. They were, again, found in like the early 1800s, and it just led to like a lot of misinformation is the best way to put it. Just like a lot of misinformation ended up being spread to the good people of Australia. um there was a man that sort of claims to have seen an attack on an Aboriginal man who had like claw marks on his chest, as well as watched a bunyip kill an Aboriginal woman. This all happened in July 1845, and this is where we see the first written use of the word bunyip appear in history. So before, everything was sort of spoken word. The legend was passed down by the Aboriginals through word of mouth. This is the first time that you really see it like written down. Like the legend has become a written down solid thing. And the account is just like a really interesting take. So this is where I go back all the way back if you've been, paying attention. Like this is a class and I'm going to quiz you. 20% of the descriptions of the bunyip are that it has a really long neck with like a small head. This is a description like that. So tying everything back together, this one is not an account of it being a seal. This is an opposite account of the other spectrum, basically. But it was just a really interesting description, and I wanted to read it. I am going to preface that there is a moment where you're like, oh, white people. And I'm sorry about that, but that's what he wrote down, and I'm going to read it because I wanted to give you the most accurate description, and I didn't want to amend it in any way. So, with that said, his account goes as follows. Quote, "The bunyip, then, is represented as uniting the characteristics of both a bird and of an alligator. It has a head resembling an emu, with a long bill, at the extremity of which is a transverse projection on each side, with serrated edges like the bone of a stingray. Its body and legs partake of the nature of the alligator. The hind legs are remarkably thick and strong, and the forelegs are much longer, but still of great strength. The extremities are furnished with long claws, but the blacks say its usual method of killing its prey is by hugging it to death. When in the water, it swims like a frog, and when on shore, it walks on its hind legs, with its head erect, in which position it measures 12 or 13 feet in height." Unquote. So I'm really sorry about that "oh, white people" moment, but it's part of the, like, he meant to say, like, the Aboriginals say, but he said it was a different time. But it's very interesting to note that, like, it's a bird alligator. Like, I just think that's such a weird image. Like, when you think of a bunyip as, like, a really big dog that's, like, gonna eat you, that, like, lives in the water, like, that's kind of scary, right? But then, like, you think of this, like, weird, like, 12-foot long emu alligator. I can't. I think that's so funny. Like, I read that and started laughing out loud. I thought it was the most ridiculous image in the world, and they're all like, it's horrifying, it's scary. And like, I'm sure if I saw it in real life, I'd be like, holy crap, I gotta get out of here. But just the image of like a 12-foot tall emu with alligator legs swimming like a frog in the water, like, that is just so funny to me. I think the part that got me was when he said it swims like a frog. Like, it doesn't swim like an alligator or like swim like a dolphin. Like, it does the weird like breaststroke thing that a frog does. It's like, that really got me. I thought it was so funny. Anyway, the last couple things is that the bunyip has even been believed in some Aboriginal tribes to have like supernatural powers. So they stay away from it because they're like, oh my god, it's like basically a god and we don't want to mess with it. It's wormed its way into like so many different books, TV shows, movies, video games. It's all over the place. Um, Mostly, I would say a lot of the media that it's still found in today is definitely in Australia. It's an Australian myth. It's popular there. But it does seep out into the rest of the world, especially in like England, and in the US, actually. We talk about the bunyip a lot because people in the US love a good conspiracy theory. They love a good, there are a lot of like cryptozoologists that just love that sort of thing. Look at me with my terms. I know I'm personally a person that I love learning about cryptids. I think they're so much fun. I think they're super duper cool. This one's more of like a mythological moment rather than a cryptid. But it kind of fits in both categories. Um, and I just think that it's such a weird myth, such a weird legend. Obviously fascination with this creature like is still persisted today. I mean, I'm talking about it on my podcast. There's books about it. There's TV shows that have episodes featuring the bunyip. There's all sorts of stuff like that. And it's one of those myths that kind of like sticks with you because of how bizarre it is. There is no reason that these people should have believed that like this creature existed. Like, it sounds ridiculous, but also like if I was just to describe what a kangaroo was to you and you had no idea what it was, you'd be like, that's not a real thing. Like, it sounds ridiculous. Like a wombat, a platypus, and echidna. Like, especially a platypus. Like, platypus are just weird. They are one of my favorite animals of all time, ever, in the whole world. My gamer tag for years and years and years and years and years was platypus. It still is in some games that I play. Um, and I just love them. I think they're so cool. I've done so many projects. I've done so much research on them. They're just a cool creature. If I could have one as a pet, like in Phineas and Ferb, I would. Hands down, that would be my pet, and I'd be so happy about it. Unfortunately, that's not really a thing. But that creature's weird. It has like a duck bill, and then it has like a beaver tail, and it lays eggs, but also like it's not like it walks on all fours, and it kind of looks like a log. Like, they're a very strange creature, and I think that it would be very jarring as someone who came from a place where like cattle and sheep exist to come down and sort of see that as like a normal creature in the wild. Like, that to me would just be a very jarring experience. So the belief of the bunyip really just stemmed from misinformation and the fact that they were just uneducated at that point in biology and anatomy of creatures and things like that. Like, for all we know too, maybe at this time the bunyip really did exist. Maybe it was a thing that actually existed and then became extinct before we had the chance to sort of document it. Like, that's also very possible because we're always learning things about history and about our past that are correct and incorrect. There's all sorts of things like, oh my god, can we talk about the fact that dinosaurs have feathers now? Like, 90% of dinosaurs are actually feathered and not scaly. Isn't that weird? Like, that to me is something that was such a big deal that like I feel like nobody really like talked about. But that is such a big deal to me because you look at things like Land Before Time and why is that the only movie with dinosaurs that's coming to my head? Anyway, you look at Land Before Time, a movie that's like really popular with a lot of young people. And it sort of depicts dinosaurs in a certain way. And now that movie is so dated because now we know that dinosaurs actually have feathers. So every time you go back and watch that movie has now become a piece of history that is misinformed. Who would have thunk that? It's a children's movie with dinosaurs. Like, obviously, it's not accurate to how dinosaurs actually lived. But the fact that it doesn't get their descriptions correct because they have feathers really dates the film, right? It's stuff like that that's really interesting. So the possibility that the bunyip actually could have existed at one point is more probable than someone might actually think. I'm not good at math or statistics or anything, so like I'm not gonna try to make like a little ratio of like, it's a 1-to-1 of like, or 50%. Like, I'm not gonna do that because I don't, I graduated from online high school, but I just think it's so fascinating to think about the fact that this thing could have actually existed at some point in time. This thing could have existed and we wouldn't have known about it because we might have just grabbed bones from it and been like, yep, this is to, Diprotodon, this is to the giant wombat, we're just going to leave it alone. Even though it could have potentially gone to another creature, but you're putting together a puzzle with no ending picture. You don't know what it's supposed to come out to, It's like trying to get a box, like, a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you don't have the picture to put it together. You just have all these pieces that don't make sense, and you're trying to put together an image of something that you've never seen before, B, you don't know if it's going to come out to anything full yet, and C, you don't have the picture. Like, that's impossible. So you can't get mad at them either if they decided that, like, oh, this was a bunyip bone, but actually it's a diprotodon because, blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. But then we come to find out 15 years down the line that the bunyip was a real thing. You can't get mad at them for that because they're doing an impossible task of trying to piece together a part of history that has so many pieces and yet no outcome, you know? It's just really cool to think about. I love thinking about stuff like this and talking about it. That's part of the reason why, like, I really love doing episodes on mythological creatures. Let me know if you guys like when I do episodes like this, because I love talking about mythological creatures. I remember so many projects in school I would do on, like, vampires and zombies and werewolves and dragons and stuff like that. I know, like, some of those aren't as, like, spooky horror. Like, a dragon isn't really, like, as scary as, like, a zombie. But I like doing stuff like this. I think it's fun. If you guys really like hearing it and you like, me talking about it, then by all means let me know. And then I can start to pump out more of this stuff for you guys. In case you guys haven't figured out, as far as my formula goes for the podcast, I try to do like realistic ones for like a week or two. And then I try to do like a myth one in between there, or like a story one to kind of like break them up so that you're not getting like true crime every single week. Because if I wanted to do a true crime podcast, I would have done a true crime podcast. True crime podcast. But I didn't. I like doing topic based stuff and I like talking about different things all the time. So let me know if there are any topics in particular that I've done or that you want me to do that you think would just fit really well with the theme. Obviously, like, Bunyip isn't as, like, spooky horror dark, so sometimes it doesn't have to be that. It can just be, like, the idea of something that's scary. It could also be, like, I know a lot of people have asked me to do, like, creepypasta stuff, or, oh my god, what are those, like, SCPs? I had someone ask me if I could do an episode on SCPs. That is some lore that is just really hard to get into. I'm doing research on it, like really, really trying to figure that stuff out. But if there's stuff like that that you really want me to do, like, please reach out. You can, direct message me on Instagram. Again, that's Whispers from Below at Instagram. You know, that's the handle. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. You can also email me if you have a lot of information. Like, my dad, shout out to Jim, he's adorable, and if he has like notes or anything, or he'll be like, you should do this, he'll send it to me as like, he's such a businessman, he'll send it to me as like a written email. It's like spell checked and fact checked, and it's in all these neat little paragraphs. Like, it's very cute. But if that's something that you're more down to do, you can also email me. The email is whispersfrombelow@gmail.com. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. If there's one thing that I can ask of you guys to do this week, besides just like showing some love and support for your friends and family. I know a lot of people are going through a lot right now. You can show your love and support for me. I would really, really appreciate it right now. I've had some personal stuff going on. It's been a rough week for me. But this is one thing that I love doing. It brightens my day. It makes me happy. I love doing the podcast, and I hope that it's something that you guys are all loving. If it is, please, please, please share it. Even if you just share it, you don't have to share it on social media. If you want to, please do. Please put it on your story and be like, I like this podcast, please check it out. Like, I would love that. Or if it's just one other person and you talk to that person and you say, hey, I listened to this really dorky guy talk about scary stuff and he's pretty cool and the podcast is pretty cool. You should check it out. I would absolutely love that, because if I get all of you guys to tell one person and that one person decides to listen, that doubles my listeners. So if I can ask just one thing of all of you guys, it would be to do that. I would absolutely appreciate if you guys could just share the podcast, even if it's just verbally. Something like that would be absolutely amazing. If you want to share it on social media and tag me and the podcast in it, that'd be like super dope. And I would like love you forever. But if that makes you uncomfortable, then don't. Just talk to someone about it. I would even accept that. I think that'd be cool too. That's all I really have today to talk about. So remember, bunyips definitely could have existed. Apparently, they swim like frogs. And, stay safe. Please, please, please.